Okay, I'm just going to do another one of my little videos. Go back to the 1970s and the 1980s. Well, probably more so the 1970s and 60s. And Dad could support, on an average income, a mortgage on a quarter-acre section with a, I don't know, 2, 3 bedroom home. Support his wife and kids. His wife doesn't need to work and has a car as well. In other words, he could live like a rich man, a truly rich man. Today, that is, of course, absolutely impossible, no matter how frugal you try to be. We all know that. We've got people talking about us getting richer and richer and economic development, but I think that's bullshit. It's got to be bullshit. If we're richer, it's because we're richer in things that don't really matter, whereas the cost of living has gone mental compared to older times. It's not about frugality. It's it's way worse than that, whatever's gone on. So I would like to throw four great demons into the equation to suggest what's gone on with the collapse in affordability in spite of huge gains in industrial efficiency that have happened as well. I mean, in principle, we should be way richer than we ever were, but we're not. Some things are a lot cheaper. But again, not the things that really matter if you want to have kids or a traditional sort of a life. Okay, the first one is the most obvious one. We have a much larger retired population. So the ratio between producers and dependents has shrunk hugely. Okay, it's wonderful that people can now live into their 80s and even 90s rather than 60s and 70s, but my God, it's expensive. 2, regulations. We have big government. Big government is very, very expensive, and it's expensive on two accounts when you're talking regulations. The cost of government to create and enforce the regulations, and the cost on business to comply to the regulations. Not to mention the fact that regulations stuff up a business's ability to innovate and make qualitative improvements as well. Now, you have to ask yourself, why doesn't business fight this to reduce their costs? And it's because if it's a domestic business, if it's not an export business at least, they don't care. They don't care about regulations. They have no reason to. Because if the government says we're going to force you to increase costs by complying to this and that, business just goes, well, does the guy down the road, my competition, have to conform to those costs as well? And yes, they do. Well, no problem. I just raise my prices and hand it on to the consumer. And the consumer will have to pay for it because my competition has to raise their prices too. It's no big deal. That's why there's no real fight against it, even though it costs us consumers so much money with parasitic regulations that regulators keep wanting to do. Then there's education. This is like a holy thing. We think that you can't get enough education. Okay. To make my point on this very clear, I'll give you a very simple example. Imagine I created a little course that teaches you 100 words, new words, obscure words out of the English dictionary, and you learned all those words and all those meanings and then got 100% on the test. Is that education? It's memory. It's not education. It's not education until you actually use those words naturally in normal communications. So it becomes part of your working vocab. Otherwise, it's just sitting on your hard drive as bullshit learning because nothing is truly learnt until we work with it. I would argue 90% of education is pseudo-education, where we become little more than Google search engines, and very bad ones at that compared to Google, and is a horrific waste of time. But we're forcing all these people to go to university now when they could have been out producing and doing real things and getting much more of a real education, believe it or not, if they just left school at 15, as most students did back in the day. So we have massively inflated education, and the economics for doing it are quite perverse. The economic rationale is quite perverse. If you create an educational demand which says, before you can do this job, you have to have an honours degree in this, that, or the other, then that education becomes its own justification because it becomes a barrier to entry to that profession. It restricts the supply, which leads to an inflation of the wages. Absolutely crazy, because not only does the taxpayer have to subsidize that education, the student, when they're learning, when 4 or 5 years in university, is not producing. And our reward for doing that, after that huge cost, huge waste, is we have to pay twice as much due to the artificial barrier to entry for the same service from the student when they go out to the workplace than we otherwise would have had to, quite possibly. It's a monster, absolute monster that needs to be cut back. But of course, once you create these big monsters, they're very hard to come back because the tertiary industry, the education industry, is an empire and it can pay off politicians just like any other operation. That's why these things tend to be a one-way street. So hard to reform and bring back. Money is power. And then there's the fourth one, the fourth huge factor that we're all very familiar with nowadays in New Zealand, housing affordability. It costs $200,000 to build a new modest home on an urban fringe. In real terms, if only the government took the regulatory boot off the throat of the property market and allowed us to build on rural cost land and allowed us to import Asian good quality kit sets from China or whatever. Very, very difficult to do that politically because, you kind of join the dark side once you've got a mortgage. You become part of the army of voters who only want property prices to go up. So there are 4 huge changes that we've had since the 50s and 60s, which are overwhelmingly parasitic and have dramatically increased the cost of living with artificial costs all over the place. The way to get around it, like the retired population, is to means test the pension. So you end up with a situation where a guy at the age of 70 might do just 20 hours work to prop up their income, and then the government will come in with whatever money they need after that, if they're able-bodied. So means test it. Get rid of the idea that people should receive the dole just because of their age. Very politically difficult. Grey power votes, unlike young people. That's why it hasn't been reformed, even though it really needs to. Regulations, that should be the easiest one to reform. Donald Trump had a really good policy on that. I love him or hate him. He had a really good policy. He made the condition to the regulators, who have to keep themselves busy. For every new regulation you introduce, you have to remove 2. So what do? They go, we really want this regulation, we're going to put it in place, but before we can do that, we have to work out which ones we don't really need and get rid of them. Fantastic, perfect. So simple, so effective, and I understand that it was extremely effective. Education, stop subsidizing it for the most part. If we truly stop subsidizing education and throw it out to the free market as it should be, we would very quickly discover how virtually anything can be learnt so efficiently online. And if we move to much more heavily to an apprenticeship-based format of education, we would dramatically reduce irrelevance. Education should grow with the individual's career so it's relevant and real to them and becomes part of their working education, like the working memory example I have with learning words. Housing affordability, that's such a difficult nut to crack. The best thing you can do is inform people that ultimately New Zealand, if we don't build affordable housing, other countries such as Australia, South America, Indonesia, wherever, will start building them for us, and your kids are going to run out of this country. They're going to laugh at the $1 million bill for a house when they can get another one for $200,000 in Thailand or whatever, and work online from there. Okay, it's only a matter of time till that sort of a progression will happen. New Zealand cannot survive with its current housing affordability. Already we've got people dying on hospital waiting lists because we can't attract the doctors and nurses into this country and make them want to stay here, because we basically rob them with the cost of living, which should not exist. So, hey, you got your $1 million, $2 million house, but you're a dead man at the age of 70 from a disease that was treatable because you died on the waiting list. Get your priorities right. But yeah, there's probably a whole lot more to it than that, but that's 4 big ones I can think of is, basically what happened. Why the hell did we get so poor in real terms? But what I would like to see is think tanks, especially the New Zealand Initiative, which I have a lot of respect for, simply putting out a whopping great report that says what happened, or something like that, that talks about their understanding of why we can't afford jack fiddly diddly squat compared to the past on the things that really matter. Is it not a pertinent question? Right, and to finish my statement, I will just say one other thing. You can speculate on motives all you like, but I have, since the beginning of time, I've gone on about this for years, speculated that China is not the only country on this planet that takes population stability very, very seriously. If we backtrack and go back to the 1950s and 60s with modern technology and the power of modern technology and our industrial base, go back to having free-range kids because we create safe environments for them, so everything becomes easy and much more natural, and get rid of over-institutionalized education and on, it becomes incredibly easy for people to have big families and even a lot of fun to have big families, because we've also done an enormously good job of making child rearing as painful and expensive as possible. I sometimes wonder if that's the idea of all these huge changes at their heart boiled down to, some kind of deep state's answer to the question, how do we stop the baby boom? Maybe I'm wrong, but my God, everything has long looked like that. It could be right. Again, China's probably not the only country that takes population stability and long-term planning seriously. Right, that's what I want to say. I hope you found that interesting. See you later.